Jerusalem. 2,000 years ago, a city in turmoil. A man is sentenced to death and nailed to a cross. He dies and they put him into a tomb. But eyewitnesses report that they met him alive on the third day after his death. Can a human being rise from the dead? Who is this Jesus who the witnesses say died and came back to life? Is he really risen from the dead, as the Bible says? Is he really the Son of God, as he claimed to be? Or was he a fraud, a liar, and a lunatic, as his opponents claimed he was? The Bible reports that Jesus was born 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, in Bethlehem, a small and insignificant village. Today, mainly Muslims live here. Christians are a minority. Churches here remind us of the man whose name is known around the world. "100 miles further north is a small village called Nazareth. It was such an insignificant place that people made jokes about it. Jesus lived here with his family. Jesus grew up in the Jewish tradition. He learned all about the Old Testament and the Jewish writings. As an adult, he became a rabbi. He heals many people of their illnesses and teaches them to understand the will of God. He also claims he is the Son of God. He is loved by the common people. Yet the Jewish establishment considers him to be a blasphemer, and the Romans a troublemaker. The political system gets out of hand. The rulers want to get rid of him. His disciples abandon Jesus. The Roman procurator, Pilate, condemns him to die on a cross. Is it possible to find out whether this story is true? Is there any evidence to confirm that it really happened? How can we find answers to these questions? As with many complex scientific questions, there are different approaches to finding an answer. We'll let some experts give their insights into this issue. We'll also visit Nazareth village in the north of Israel with an open-air museum where they built houses in the same way as they did 2,000 years ago, and a model of a garden tomb. Here we'll reconstruct some of the events of Jesus' life, which will help us to understand what happened then. According to biblical and non-biblical reports, Pilate condemned Jesus. He is nailed by the Roman soldiers to a cross. Jesus dies, and Joseph of Arimathea places him in his family tomb. What happened after his crucifixion and burial? This question has been answered in different ways. A variety of theories have surfaced about what might have happened. Maybe Jesus hadn't really died, or his corpse was stolen by his disciples. Did the disciples go to the wrong tomb, or did they have hallucinations? Or did they create a legend in order to maintain their faith in Jesus? What really happened? What kind of evidence is there for the death and resurrection of Jesus?
Jesus
is arrested. He is escorted to the cross by a guard. That is well documented. Roman soldiers guard the cross. His death, too, is expressly verified. And before he is taken from the cross, there is the order to make sure that he is really dead. It is described how a Roman soldier thrust his lance into his side. And, so goes the report, blood and water came out. Obviously, I am no medical doctor. The process of blood coagulation had progressed so far that they could say, this man is really dead. So Jesus was really dead.
Pilate specifically sent, when they asked for Jesus' body so that they could bury him before the holiday started and the Sabbath, Pilate sent and he's had someone confirm that Jesus was actually dead.
If you examine the documents carefully, you'll see there's not one statement that denies that Jesus really died. But couldn't it be that Jesus was just seemingly dead? What do the experts say?
First, the Romans knew when a person was dead. Second, the Roman soldiers were responsible to see to it that the crucified man was really dead. Otherwise, they had to pay with their own lives. Third, we are told that Jesus was laid into a new tomb in the rock, closed by a huge rolled stone. Even if he had only been seemingly dead and woke up, he was so weak, remember, he had been scourged, had lost a large amount of blood, that it is unthinkable that he would have been able to roll the stone away from inside.
Not only do the Gospels and the epistles, of course, talk about his death, but even non-Christian historians say that he was put to death under Pontius Pilate, and they have no special axe to grind, they have no special agenda. They're just telling us the simple historical fact that Pilate put to death Jesus of Nazareth. So there's not really a remote chance that Jesus survived the cross. He did die.
He didn't come to his disciples and say, oh, that was close. You know, they almost got me, but I woke up in the tomb and the Lord has given me more years for my ministry. No. You know, we have Jesus coming to his disciples saying, I was dead and I'm alive.
How do you want to explain that a man who had been hanging on a cross for hours, who had lost a lot of blood, who was taken from the cross and who had survived this ordeal, what might have happened very rarely, that such a man is acclaimed by his followers as the King of life, the victor over death? He certainly did not look like that.
Would he have been walking around wounded, hardly able to walk? This wasn't the image, this wasn't the risen Lord that was witnessed by the disciples and by the 500 eyewitnesses. This was a man that was radiant, that was strong, that inspired them to go out and preach that he was risen, even against the authorities of Rome, knowing that they would be put to death. This wouldn't have been a wounded, broken, dying man.
The authors of the Gospels state that Jesus was dead and laid in a private garden tomb shortly before the Feast of Passover began. What happened then? Early on the third day, the women who followed Jesus came to the tomb. The stone was rolled away. The tomb was empty. Where was the body of Jesus? Could it be that the disciples were able to steal him out of the tomb? How believable is the theory that the Roman soldiers had fallen asleep while the disciples stole the body?
Well, Roman soldiers who fall asleep on their guard anywhere were actually severely punished and oftentimes put to death. They knew that that would be there looming if in fact they did fall asleep.
The soldiers recognized that he wasn't there, and they went and reported to their superiors in fear for their lives that they had somehow dropped the ball. And their superiors said, "Don't worry, we will cover it, nothing will happen to you, and we will report as a way of explaining this that the disciples came while you were asleep and stole the body away." I think if I was one of those soldiers, I would have said, "Can't we come up with a little better story than this? Sleeping on duty is not something that gets a soldier rewards. He can get in big trouble." But we're not told what happened to those soldiers afterwards. But this was the first attempt at explaining what happened, that the tomb is empty, that Jesus is not there. And they invented this idea that the disciples had stolen the body away.
Offensichtlich kam es vor.
Apparently it happened that corpses were stolen. There is a famous inscription from Nazareth saying that it is forbidden to steal corpses from the tombs. We don't know if this has anything to do with Jesus of Nazareth. But apparently it was a problem, and the New Testament writings refer to this. That's why guards were placed in front of the tomb, and the suspicion is expressly uttered. Or they might steal the body and say afterwards that he is risen from the dead. This was suspected right from the beginning, and that's why they took measures to prevent it.
To imagine the disciples, a group of frightened men who'd gone away, who'd run away actually, and were in hiding, who would suddenly become brave enough to overcome the Roman guards, to move the stone, to remove the body and hide it, is inconceivable.
If I were living in the first generation and I had followed a religious teacher who I really admired and he died, I don't think that I would just want to be part of a movement that would steal the body and say he rose from the dead. What reward would there be in that? What would be the benefit of such a fraud? There's no financial gain there. What would be the logic? It's just absurd to think that you would perpetrate that type of a hoax and then die for it.
The Sea of Galilee today. On these shores, Jesus and his disciples lived in close fellowship. Here, Jesus performed many miracles, talked with his disciples about his death, his resurrection, and his coming again. Could it be that their experiences with Jesus were so intense that they wished him back to the point of hallucinating the events of his resurrection?
The idea of a hallucination of this type, where it would be first being seen by 12, then in some women, and then being seen again up in the Galilee, then being seen again on the Mount of Olives as he's about to ascend into heaven, where it isn't just a dozen, but it is a mass of people who actually had witnessed the risen Lord. It can't be just a single hallucination that took place that invented this whole story.
These people did not behave in the way that doctors would describe someone who's hallucinating. They behaved in a very human way. First of all, they showed how they were grief-stricken, shocked, traumatized, full of remorse. They hadn't expected Jesus to be taken in the middle of the night and crucified. Then, when they saw him, they were totally changed. But still, some of them were unbelieving and doubtful and skeptical, and their stories differed. Their reactions differed. They did not behave like people that were hallucinating. They behaved like ordinary human beings, you and me, who were trying to make sense of all the amazing things that were going on.
The New Testament tells about Thomas, a disciple of Jesus. He was a skeptic and doubted that Jesus had really risen from the dead.
Now, when Jesus did appear to the disciples after he rose, there was actually one of the disciples missing. This was Thomas. We have the expression in English at least, doubting Thomas, someone who's not ready to accept everything that he hears and is doubtful that it's really true. And he got this name because when they told him that Jesus was alive, Thomas, rather than being hallucinated and saying, "Oh, fantastic, I knew that was going to happen," said, "No, I don't believe it. Unless I see him myself and I can touch him physically, I'm not going to believe that he was alive." And so then a week later, Jesus comes, appears to them again. Thomas is there this time, and he says, "Okay, here I am, touch me and see." And at that point, Thomas does believe. Again, I think that this weakens the idea that there was some kind of mass hallucination.
In that period following the death of Yeshua, they actually studied with him for approximately 40 days. They ate with him, they lived with him, they studied with him, just like before. He was preparing them for the persecution they were going to face afterwards.
How many instances do we have in history of a whole group of people having the same hallucination at the same time, and they're ready to give their lives for the truth of it?
Another author of the New Testament became a follower only after Jesus' death. Paul. He himself was not an eyewitness to the events surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Paulus ist für uns deswegen ein interessanter Charakter.
Paul is such an interesting personality for us because he did not belong to the group of disciples when Jesus died and rose again. He writes about himself that he is an educated Pharisee, that he studied in the school of Rabbi Gamaliel, a famous teacher of that time, that he persecuted the church during the first years after Jesus' death. He was an opponent of the Jesus movement.
The New Testament describes how Paul traveled from Jerusalem to Damascus, armed with letters from the high priest, ordering the arrest of those Jews who believed in Jesus. But on his way there, he had a life-changing encounter.
Die Gemeinde verfolgt und berichtet dann aber, dass
He had persecuted the church, but then he reports that he himself met the risen Jesus. After that, he started his quest and began to inquire what this resurrection was about, searching new facts. He explains in a letter why he now knows that Jesus is risen. Jesus is risen according to Scripture, and he has been seen by different people. Then he tells their names and goes on, up to 500 people have seen him. Paul didn't sit down and say, "I want to write down a plea for the resurrection." No, he wrote a very personal letter to the people in the city of Corinth. And in it, he says that there are 500 eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, and that some of them are still alive. Of course, that tells us a lot about the facts. Paul would have been stupid if he had maintained the resurrection and it were not true. The Corinthians might have asked the eyewitnesses who were still alive and might have found out that it was not true at all.
Denn die Korinther hätten ja diese lebenden Augenzeugen dann fragen können und hätten herausgefunden, es war gar nicht so.
Throughout the history of humanity, there have been heroes who were venerated and who were objects of myths and legends.
In the generations that follow, things can be elaborated on in any story. The mythology follows on after many generations after being out of contact with the real story. What's important here is that what we have are eyewitness accounts of what took place, because it isn't just any myth. It's a real story that took place in real history.
It was a physical event, but it's a physical event with very, very large spiritual meaning for those who accept it. Christianity is a historical religion. If it's not a historical religion, it's nothing.
In the gospel texts, the followers of Jesus talk about the resurrection of Jesus in a very individual way. You can sense their dismay at his death, but after his resurrection, they seem to have an unshakable hope.
Whether we believe these people or not has to come from another source than my knowing them and how reliable they are because I have met them and I know what kind of people they are. It has to come from what kind of an impact it had on their lives. And that is something amazing.
After the death of Yeshua, it's remarkable that a few days later, they are willing to risk their lives. They're willing to speak before kings and potentates and risk getting their heads cut off or crucified. Something happened, and I don't think anything but a resurrection, I don't think anything but Yeshua coming back to life could have so dramatically changed their courage.
The impact of the resurrection on the disciples was dramatic.
They were ready to go in the face of the Roman Empire, which says there's a multitude of deities. They were ready to be thrown into amphitheaters to fight wild animals. Or they were thrown into amphitheaters to fight one another. People gave their lives for this. And not only that, their lifestyle changed because of what they believed about Jesus. Now try and pass that all off on some kind of a bad dream that they had.
The traumatized and disoriented disciples were suddenly changed into courageous and extremely convincing personalities.
In Judaism, you had to come up with 2 witnesses. He had 12. He had more witnesses. 12 witnesses, 24 witnesses. How many witnesses do you need to the risen Lord before you accept the fact that these people who went on to die for what they saw were committed enough this time around not to deny that they knew him anymore, but were so overwhelmed by this fact of his resurrection that they said he did die and he did rise from the dead as he said he would.
This encounter with the living Jesus made a huge difference to his followers and gave them a hope far beyond death.
In the end, it doesn't matter how much scientific work you do. People, if they want to believe something, people will believe it. People who don't want to believe something, they won't believe it. But in the end, those of us who also want to see the sense behind it, if you really pursue it and all the facts that lie in line with the historical story of Jesus and his life, his death and resurrection, it has come to the satisfaction of almost all scholars today that something did in fact happen there.
Wenn das wirklich passiert ist,
If that really happened, if Jesus really rose from the dead, we ought to see everything he said before his death about himself in a new light, because now it is, so to speak, confirmed by a higher institution.
It happened 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. Jesus Christ died on the cross according to the eyewitnesses. The memory of his death and his nameless grave would have fallen into oblivion. But after his death, something extraordinary happened, something that caused a deep change in some people's lives. They said they met Jesus after his death. Could it really be that this unbelievable thing happened? That this Jesus rose from the dead? There is evidence that he did. Isn't it possible, then, that there is a dimension that goes beyond our mortal lives? Because of his resurrection, Jesus would be the first person to prove this.
This first resurrected person telling us about what God's purposes are, he then gives us a promise that this is going to be played out in a totally different dimension in the future.
Because we know now that death doesn't have the final word, we can look at life from a new perspective which goes beyond death.
The great triumph, the great climax of history will be his second coming.
When we are convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead, then this means that the fact about his coming back is also real.
The resurrection is actually seen in the New Testament as a guarantee of Jesus' return and, what is very significant, of the resurrection of those who believe in him.